Okay, we're going to do a book review. James H. Sweet, Domingos, Alvarez, African Healing and the Intellectual History of the Atlantic World. This book was published in 2011. This is a bottom-up history, very similar to the Many-Headed Hydra, Linebaugh and Rediker. But what's unique about this book is that it attempts to give a history from the slave/African perspective. It's a micro-history where it is following one person, and it is an attempt to not give an Atlantic history through the perspective of whites, because generally in Atlantic history, if they are referring to slaves or Africans, it's still through the perspective of Europeans. The attempt by Sweet in finding these Inquisition papers, which was a big file, basically an FBI file of its time, of this particular man, was to be able to put his story and his perspective together and tell how he saw it. Now, there are some points as to where they give other perspectives, but the entire goal is to give Africa a voice in the transatlantic Atlantic history, which is very much looked over. Story real simple. This person was a healer in the Benin area, probably a member of the Yoruba tribe. He was a healer. He was part of a healing community, and this community would hide refugees from the violence that was going on. The elites in Africa were at war, and they would take prisoners of war, and that's who they sold to the Portuguese for slavery, which goes back to our previous book by Thornton, as to where Thornton was saying the elites in Africa were equal to the elites of Portugal, and they were doing what they did, warring against each other and taking people and selling them into slavery that were their enemies. So it was kind of given some, it was aligning with Thornton's perspective of the economies of England and Africa being equal. Because they, in this healing community, would hide other slaves that caught the ire of the elite, the African elite that was over that area, and ultimately Domingos Alvarez was captured, sold into slavery, and when he was sent to Brazil, he maintained his reputation of being a healer. And this is also consistent with Thornton's perspective that that the Africans did not lose their culture in the Middle Passage. And Alvarez became such a healer and such a notable healer in Brazil that people of all races, ethnic backgrounds, cultures, classes came to him to get healed, to the point that he was able to generate enough money to free himself, and he started communities of healing communities in different areas. Well, obviously this drew enough attention and notoriety because what he did worked. It actually did something, as opposed to Catholicism that, pray and hope things get better. And Catholicism being the power industry it was and had a great deal of social control in its design, did not like that, and they actually ended up bringing him up on charges of heresy and devil worship and all of these crazy things. And he was then brought back to Portugal to be tried. So that means this man's life, this 700-page file, takes him from Africa to Brazil back to Portugal. So this is a well-traveled African at this point. And ultimately, you know, he was tortured, and they tried to get him to admit that he was a devil worshiper. Now, what that actually implies is that the voodoo practices that he did worked as far as healing people. And he did explain that a lot of it was the knowing the medicines, the roots, the natural healings. And it also proved that it was superior to whatever the Catholic Church was doing. Also, part of his trial was to force him to admit that he had sold his soul to the devil. And he kept telling them that he had not derived from or diverted from Catholicism, which he was obviously Christianized when he was brought to Brazil. That was part of the cognitive dissonance of Portugal when they enslaved these people. They made it in their minds that they had to do this to civilize these Africans so they can go to heaven. So there's a lot of things playing here, but it cannot be denied that they believed that what he did worked. They just felt in their superiority. If we know God, you must be doing something by the devil. Now, there is a lot of history, and this book doesn't go into it, and I was disappointed that it didn't, that 100% of Catholicism comes out of Vodun, or what Europeans call voodoo. So that's actually something to look into. So it's very well likely that that was why converting Africans into Catholicism was not hard, because it aligns with the African stories perfectly. In fact, that's where a lot of people discredit or have an issue with Christianity or Catholicism, because it aligns exactly to many African writings and African stories. So it's just the names are different. So it would not be a big issue for him to be healing people in the way of Vodun and still be practicing Catholicism. Well, ultimately he was exiled, and the story was not a good ending for him. But where this writing was important was it attempted to give a perspective from an African's point of view, which most Atlantic history tends to ignore. And again, this is 2011, so this is very recent. 2, it supports some of Thornton's perspectives of the fact that the Middle Passage did not take away the culture of the African. Now, where my argument is with that is this person was probably an exceptional healer. I mean, to have accomplished what he accomplished, this wasn't your average healer. And we still don't know what percentage of his of the culture that was not transmitted due to the horrific experience of the Middle Chamber, that, well, the Middle Passage, I'm sorry, for those of you, I'm going into that now. The Middle Passage, we don't know what percentage did not make it, and how many people who were not as well versed in that or had minds as strong as he had, how they were affected by the Middle Passage. So you can't take one particular example and say, see, no one was affected in the Middle Passage like that. Some people are really seasick. Some people traumatize easier than others. There's some people who can go to war and none of it bother them, and some people who go to war and have PTSD. So I felt that that was a bit of an overstatement. equality between the European governments and the African governments, definitely definitely well illustrated with this particular historiography. And I'm going to go over a minute just to get to one point when we were talking about the African culture not being stripped in the Middle Passage. And I had a debate in class with the professor as to where immigrants from other countries who came through Ellis Island had the ability to bring their culture over almost intact and replicated in the New World, as to where Africans did not have that ability. And that really discredits Thornton's perspective, because they were limited within the bounds of what they were allowed to do and bring and express, as opposed to your Jewish, your Italians, your Poles, your Czechs. They were able to bring their communities over almost in totem and recreate them to the degree they felt appropriate. That's a major difference between the Africans in the transatlantic and the forced immigrants and the unforced immigrants.